Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Jenna Pache, Director of Marketing and Brand Experience with the Sullivan Group. Today's webinar is Diagnostic Error, More Than Malpractice Claims. The motivation for discussing this important topic comes from a recent white paper we put together. After today's presentation, we'll send a follow-up email with a link to access this white paper and an opportunity to set aside time to engage Dr. Sullivan or Syzek with additional questions or any follow-up information you may need. To that end, we won't be hosting a live Q&A today. Still, you can chat your questions during the presentation and we can follow up after the event. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Dr. Dan Sullivan is a board-certified emergency physician with a legal background. He is the former chairman of the ACEP Medical Legal Committee and academic faculty for ACEP Medical Directors Academy. He also serves as an associate professor at Cook County Hospital in Chicago. In addition to his clinical practice, Dan started the Sullivan Group in 1998 and continues to serve as president and CEO. Dr. Tom Syzek is also a board-certified emergency physician and the former Chief Clinical Risk Officer for Premier Physician Services. In addition to his role at Premier, Tom formerly served as president for their medical malpractice insurance company. Tom is the VP of Education for the Sullivan Group, overseeing all new education development and helping provide clinical risk expertise for our new clients and partners. So without further ado, Dr. Sullivan.
Well, good morning or afternoon, everyone. So happy to be here. First, I want to say thanks to the team that worked on the white paper and who worked on putting this presentation together. Just a wonderful, wonderful work together, work product on the white paper. I hope you're interested in taking a look at that. And then this slide presentation really took a group of very talented people from the Sullivan Group. So thanks, and Tom for slogging around with me and in risk and safety all these years to coming together for this presentation. Really looking forward to it. And really happy to be here with you all. I looked at the attendee list and on that list are partners and colleagues, friends, some really close friends, and I couldn't be happier than to be with you. I guess I could be if we were all in a room together and we were actually interacting together. That'd be better. But given the circumstances, this is the best we can do. But I think we have some really special information and very exciting information to share with you today. And so with that, let's jump in. And talk about our journey for today. Diagnostic errors. The scope of this problem is not adequately represented by malpractice claims, a major focus of today's discussion, diagnostic errors. We're going to look beyond malpractice claims at research at the cutting edge. Diagnostic error analysis. What is causing the breakdown in the diagnostic process? And finally, solutions. Working in partnership with other organizations, and we haven't talked to you in a while. You may not have seen some of the things that the Sullivan Group has been up to in the last few years, but it's incredibly exciting. Partnership with Nuance and Dragon and using their artificial intelligence platform, our partnership in new care coordination platforms, just very, very exciting. So let's start with a very brief case presentation, and we'll use that to launch into the medical error problem and the diagnostic error problem. So this case is a 25-year-old man who presents to the emergency department with low back pain. Based on his history of recently lifting furniture, emergency physician diagnosed musculoskeletal strain. Now this is garden variety, walks in the emergency department all the time, several times a day. We're dealing with back pain. Almost always lumbosacral strain, no big deal. A patient as well is discharged on Motrin and maybe some follow-up with physical therapy. But not this patient. This patient returned, bounced back, and for the purpose of this discussion today, and keep that phrase in mind. This is a bounce back. Some on Monday, comes back on Wednesday, bounces back. 2 days later with worsened pain with a diagnosis of spinal epidural abscess. We're going to use this as sort of a theme through today's presentation. You'll hear about it now, you'll hear about it in just a moment, and then toward the end of the presentation. This patient had a spinal epidural abscess with a lengthy hospitalization, but ultimately there was no malpractice claim filed. But let's drill down and do a cognitive autopsy on this case. In retrospect, what did this look like? Well, this emergency physician never asked about a history of a fever, and that was medical error number one. There was a fever, and it was on the patient track board, which is visible for all to see, but it was not seen by this emergency physician. It's number two. The patient, in fact, had a temperature of 102, and some of you work with insurance companies, insurance brokerages, but those of you working as medical practitioners in Epic and Cerner and Meditech know that you enter some data in the chart, but some of it is auto-entered by the program. Well, a temperature of 102 was auto-entered into the chart, but was never seen by this emergency physician. Again, if you saw those charts, you'd know that it's just not one piece of paper anymore that's all in the visual. You got to scroll up a couple of screens to see stuff and then scroll down 4 or 5 screens. Well, there was a temperature in there that this practitioner never saw. Never saw the fever. Never considered a predisposition for an epidural process. Never thought about it. This patient was an IV drug user. Medical error number 4. This patient had 2 levels of pain. That is not typical musculoskeletal pain. Should have considered a broader differential diagnosis based upon the fever, based upon the predisposition because of IV drugs, based upon multiple levels of pain. We're going to revisit this case a little bit later, but there's medical error number 5. And that's my tee up to talk about malpractice claims and medical errors. And our focus for years, and I know I've been doing this for 30 years, 22 years as the Sullivan Group. And many of you on this call, I know, have had that focus above the line here for many, many years. That's where Aon does all their benchmarks. That's where CRICO develops its taxonomy. Now that's where, if you've got some kind of a program, your ROI is based upon what you can do about medical malpractice claims. But as we just saw in that case, there's so much that never sees the light of day. Third leading cause, medical errors, third leading cause of death in the United States after heart disease and cancer. You say, what? That's incredible. COVID may overtake that in a couple of days, and hopefully it'll back off. But whether this is the second leading or the fifth leading, or the fact that it's even in the conversation is an amazing thing. And how many of those, ever break the water? How many of those ever actually see the light of day? Our best research in emergency medicine so far is that 9 patients out of every 100,000 discharges will die within 7 days from a medical error. When I put this into the white paper with Tom, I led off with, this is a gut punch. 9 patients. If you have a 100,000 volume emergency department, you got a patient dying almost every month from a medical error. We've got new research also, and it was really what got this discussion going, and was really the impetus for the white paper. And Tom Syzek was very much behind that, and we were sharing these articles and looking, and the data, you would never know this from medical malpractice, and that's why this research is so important. This is spinal epidural abscess. That's what that patient had that we just reviewed. This is a spinal epidural abscess, and the failure to diagnose rate is 62%. Never know that from the malpractice. That means the 2 out of 3, when they present first visit, are not being diagnosed. That's extraordinary. This is acute aortic dissection. 1 out of every 4 is being missed. Thank goodness we're finally getting the data about the true frequency. Arterial thrombosis, 1 in 4. Pulmonary embolism, 1 in 5. This really, really striking data. And here's another one from emergency medicine. A 2.9% bounce back. Remember that case? That was a bounce back. Saw him on Monday, back on Wednesday, back on Tuesday. Well, we've got good numbers on this nationally. And our national bounce back rate is 2.9%. Now that seems like a small number. If you run a 100,000 volume emergency department, that's 8 patients a day who are returning from having been discharged yesterday or a couple of days ago. And there's people on this call who have been medical directors for years. I was a medical director for years. This is what Tom did for a long time. When you look at these bounce backs, there's a very high rate of medical error, like our spinal epidural abscess case was sent home, no fever, didn't evaluate multiple locations of pain. 2.9%. I say gut punch. I say there is a ton to be learned that does not see the light of day, and that's what this is about. I mentioned Tom Syzek, is really, I mean, I'm into the literature as well. You know, Tom just does a fantastic job of diving in and providing us with, and we really do focus on diagnostic error literature. What's the best? What's the brightest? And so Tom is going to jump in now with what is below the waterline and what's the cutting edge of research into misdiagnosis. Tom?
Well, thanks, Dan. Always a pleasure to be with you, and welcome everyone, all our friends and colleagues, and thanks for your time in this topic where we live and breathe every day and are very passionate about. Well, for decades, we have learned from the malpractice claims that the #1 patient safety problem in emergency medicine is diagnostic error. Analysis of thousands of claims by us and others have shown that the key issue in acute care medicine is really the failure to make a diagnosis. However, malpractice claims, as Dan showed with that iceberg graphic, that malpractice claims are only the tip of the iceberg, since only a fraction of errors result in a claim and become evident above the waterline, so to speak, just as with the case Dan reviewed that did not result in a claim. For every malpractice claim that is made and exists in the tip of the iceberg, there are many more serious adverse events and diagnostic errors that claims data simply doesn't capture. Next. Recent reports and research dating back to 2000 and now with a more recent study, they've begun to expose and define the frequency, severity, cost, and the underlying causes of the diagnostic error problem in emergency medicine and other acute care specialties. The paper on the right, as the National Academy stated in 2015, Improving Diagnosis in Healthcare, diagnostic error is now looked at as the next frontier in patient safety. A big focus for all of us. So in the next few slides, I'll highlight some recent research studies that take us beneath the surface of malpractice litigation and expose this underwater world of diagnostic errors. So looking here, we've had in the past decades, many sources of malpractice claim data, very valuable, from our friends and partners, have informed us and others about the facts and trends in the world of malpractice litigation. These summaries and analyses continue to be extremely valuable in assessing the impact of medical errors on patients and all of us in the healthcare industry. Next, so recently the medical research, as opposed to just strictly claims research, is starting to catch up with and add and give us a deeper understanding to the data from malpractice claims. Here's just one paper. This research paper is from this year, May 2020. And we're finally getting our arms around just how many errors are actually happening. And the data is truly striking. This and other papers are now exposing the human and economic toll due to diagnostic error. And it is persistent, staggering, unacceptable, and largely preventable. So this is from the Big Three study. Everyone, it's a must read for sure. This research identified 15 diseases on the list here in 3 separate categories that account for about half of all misdiagnosis related harms in malpractice claims. These big 3 categories are cancer, vascular events, and infections. Man, if we could knock these out and get these right, what a huge impact we would have. But then the authors dove much deeper to measure the rates of misdiagnosis and serious harm and provide estimates of how often these 15 diseases are misdiagnosed, not just in claims. So for today's purposes, I'll focus just on the vascular events and infections that are commonly seen in emergency medicine and acute care, while acknowledging that cancer-related diagnostic errors are very important, but they are found largely in other specialties, including primary care. So here we are with vascular events and infections, and the findings from this Big 3 study shows error rates for specific diseases that we all know, ranging from a low on the lower left, 2.2% for acute MI, to a high, as Dan has already mentioned, of 62%, whopping number for spinal abscess. So what does this mean? This means that the diagnosis of acute MI is initially missed in 2.2% of cases, but spinal epidural abscess is initially misdiagnosed in the majority of cases, 62%, and you can see the other diagnoses are somewhere in between. Now, one thing that struck me, and it may not be rocket science to everyone, but just looking at this list, we found that the most common and familiar vascular and infectious conditions are the least likely to be misdiagnosed, such as MI, stroke on the lower left, pneumonia and sepsis on the lower right. But in contrast, it's the least common conditions that we see in clinical medicine that are the most likely to be misdiagnosed, such as spinal abscess, meningitis, and aortic diseases. I guess that's a no-brainer, but put simply, we are more likely to make diagnostic errors for conditions we don't see very often, although we still make a significant percent of errors with the commonly seen conditions. The authors noted that this is sad that they noted, diagnostic error rates for these conditions, almost all of them, have not declined over the past few decades. We haven't cracked this nut or made a huge impact for most of them. And they felt that their findings would, in their words, allow us to target diagnostic improvement initiatives to diseases with the highest error and harm rates. They gave us a target. Next. So in the previous Big 3 study that I just mentioned, the authors estimated diagnostic error rate for our old friend spinal epidural abscess was a whopping 62%. Here is a different paper that addresses the high rate of misdiagnosis in patients with spinal epidural abscess. Why is this important? Well, it's important because the incidence of spinal epidural abscess has doubled in the last 2 decades. It's still out there and has become more common. And yet, we continue to miss the diagnosis in more than half the patients. And it's not inconsequential because when a diagnostic error occurs, the result is usually serious disability or death. So we see here, sticking with spinal epidural abscess, the miss rate is high. And it's kind of vague to just say, well, this condition is misdiagnosed and leave it at that. Well, this paper went further to provide a clinically relevant definition of a diagnostic error. They defined it as a missed opportunity to evaluate specific red flags in the history, the physical exam, and the test ordering in a timely and appropriate manner in patients with back pain. Clinicians miss this diagnosis. Why? Because they did not employ and document basic clinical skills, such as evaluating fever, focal neurologic deficits, the fact that the patient may have been an IV drug abuser, or that there was another active infection present. So this study supports the fact that it is crucial to obtain key information, basic information in the history and exam, and evaluate these red flags. We call them diagnostic drivers, to include spinal epidural abscess in the differential diagnosis. If we don't evaluate these red flags, we may not even have the differential pop into our head, and then the whole diagnostic process is derailed. So it's when the appropriate diagnostic process is not employed that misdiagnosis occurs. Next. So we know from, here's another paper, we know from malpractice data that diagnostic errors are made in patients with neurologic emergencies, including stroke, Cauda equina syndrome, and of course, they thrown in as our old friend spinal epidural abscess. By the way, that's become more common, but it's still not an everyday thing. We don't see spinal epidural abscess every day. But again, if we already knew the diagnosis, what if patients walked in with the diagnosis plastered on their forehead? Then we could proceed with evidence-based treatment. Life would be a lot easier, but that's not the way it works in acute care medicine, because patients present with symptoms and signs, and they must journey through the steps in the diagnostic process with us to arrive at the correct diagnosis. So what we haven't known, and what this study addresses, is how often a patient with headache and back pain is discharged from the ED, emergency department, only to bounce back within 30 days with a serious neurologic condition or in-hospital death. So how often do we make a diagnostic error with these chief complaints? Well, most of us have probably can identify, because most of us have had a headache or back pain at one time. And these are very common chief complaints seen in emergency departments, urgent care centers, and physician offices. And most of the outcomes, as Dan mentioned, are benign. In an average year, there are millions, about 3.5 million visits to the ED for headache and for back pain. The diagnostic error rate they found in this study, which I'm not showing right here, but the diagnostic error rate was about 0.5% for headaches and 0.2% for back pain. Sounds small, but when you multiply this error rate by the millions of patients with these complaints every year, the number predicted bad outcomes is actually very large. And how large? This paper went on to estimate that 40,000 headache patients will have potential adverse diagnostic outcomes, including serious problems like misdiagnosed stroke. Likewise, for back pain, on the right, 17,000 every year in the US, back pain patients will have potential adverse diagnostic outcomes, such as spinal abscess and Cauda equina syndrome. Huge numbers and opportunities. So studies like this provide us with the best estimates of the frequency and severity of errors for specific complaints and conditions, and help give us an idea why and what clinical factors are related to these misdiagnoses. So when added to malpractice data and research, these studies, most of them very recent, help better define the scope and severity of diagnostic errors and serve as a challenge to us to come up with solutions and tools to attack these diagnostic errors. So there are more studies, and they're coming out month after month, and I will not, I'll spare you belaboring the analysis of each, but here are 2 more studies from the past 2 years, and no doubt we'll see many more published studies on this hot topic, and thanks to everyone involved in this research, it's of great help. Next. So to this point, I've talked about the recent clinical research that is expanding our understanding into diagnostic error. The more we see of this, the more I believe everyone in healthcare will benefit, especially patients and patient safety. Research into claims, as mentioned before, has also been a great value for the past decades. And I just want to wind up the focus on research with one slide on medical malpractice research. So ending here, our team at the Sullivan Group recently completed an analysis of over 7,000 emergency physician liability claims, and we found that 14 different diagnoses accounted for the highest frequency and severity of indemnity losses. The list is on the right, and just notice how many diseases on this list happen to match up with the list from clinical research I just reviewed. So this list will look familiar to almost all of you, but the million-dollar question remains, how and why these diagnoses are missed. How can we miss these things? They seem so obvious, and they're so serious and life-threatening. Well, the reason, as I mentioned before, is patients do not have the diagnosis stamped on their foreheads. Instead, they present in acute care medicine with a nebulous chief complaint, such as chest pain, headache, or back pain, most of which are benign diagnoses. But each one of these chief complaints requires a disciplined, high reliability process that helps us avert diagnostic error. So Dan, these are some of the highlights of research studies that take us above and below the waterline to explore not only malpractice claims, but clinical research that explores the frequency of diagnostic errors and the clinically relevant factors. So it seems like the common theme here is that we need to perfect the basics. We as clinicians need to perfect the basics of the diagnostic process, perform an accurate history and exam, consider risk factors, avoid cognitive errors to formulate the right differential diagnosis. And boy, do we need help doing this. So I know you're going to tell us more about research into high-risk patients and practice patterns in emergency medicine.
Thanks, Tom. That was great, and not surprised. I was just thinking about the research and the malpractice that you went through, and a couple of things really strike me. You said there's been no decline over the decades on the frequency of medical error and the failure to diagnose, and I think that really underscores a critically important point. Like, we don't have it right yet. We haven't figured it out yet. We write a lot of books and we give a lot of lectures, but you know, maybe a new paradigm is called for here, and we'll share some ideas with you around that. The other thing is it's basic tackling. It's history, exam, it's test ordering, it's medical decision making, it's basic information that is leading to these issues. And I think that's a driver for what I'm about to talk about. And then the journey. I said we're on a journey. We see the research. We know what's being missed and the frequency with which it is being missed. But it begs the question, why is it being missed? What's the deep dive? How can we get to a point where we know enough about the root cause where we can actually build something to get back to great and reduce the frequency of medical errors and patient injury? And so let me share with you some data from work we've done over the many years. We do a lot of courses online. Another thing we've done for the last 2 decades is analytics. We go into emergency departments, hundreds over the years. And we actually look at practitioner behavior. We look at in all the high risk areas. We look at how they're doing in chief complaint, history of present illness, physical exam, medical decision making. We study it. This, what you're seeing there is September 2005. We already had 170,000 patients from over 200 emergency departments. We've continued to do that over the decades. We now have close to 400,000 and millions of data points. And I use this regularly if I'm speaking at Scientific Assembly, at our Medical Directors Academy. And I want to, on this journey, I want to take you that next step and share with you where we believe, I feel like I know, that the medical errors are coming from. Here's a slice of that data. So let me just orient you here. This is one of our biggest risks in the world of emergency medicine. Abdominal pain patients over the age of 40. By frequency, probably our biggest risk. And we've got 16,000. Actually, we probably have 25 now. But this analysis that was published is 16,000 of these patients in over 200 emergency departments. There isn't any other data on the planet like this. And so let's focus here for a minute. These are those elements of the history physical examination. There are other elements here, but for the purposes of this discussion, really basic elements of the history and the physical examination. And why are we missing abdominal aortic aneurysm in 1 in 4 cases? So let's focus on that. What's missing? What's missing. What are we overlooking? Why are we missing abdominal aortic aneurysm? Well, just bear with me. This is 16,000 patients is the denominator, and this number is how often we're in compliance with asking about the onset of pain. That doesn't look like the problem. 97%, pretty good. Location of pain, 97%. That's probably not the problem. So let's focus on the problem. Radiation of pain in a 60-year-old with abdominal pain is question number one. You've got pain in your stomach. Is it radiating to your back? Because that's an abdominal aortic aneurysm. Is it radiating to the flank? Is it radiating to the right lower quadrant? That is a diagnostic driver. You ask that question. Now we're just looking at documentation here. We don't have a video on these folks, but look what they did for onset and location. They asked the questions, they wrote them down. This was not present in 10,000 cases. You ask about a risk predisposition to abdominal aortic aneurysm. Hey, did your mom have one? Did your dad have one? Do you have a high risk predisposition? There was nothing on these charts in 10,000. Detailed abdominal examination was missing in 1,000. If you're thinking about an abdominal aortic aneurysm, you feel the belly for a mass because that's where you find it. And that wasn't there in 5,000 cases. Pulses was not there in 10,000. It's the aorta. You got to be feeling pulses. Repeat, very abnormal vital signs. So, there's a number of factors here. These are some of them. And, if I'm opening up my insurance company, and I've asked medical directors all over the country, hundreds of times, are you comfortable here? Is this where you want your patients and your practitioners to be? No. The answer is always no. This isn't good enough. We need these numbers at 90% plus if we're going to do a good job in abdominal pain patients over the age of 40. And we have these on all the serious chief complaints, but let's just drill down on chest pain just as one more. You're looking for pulmonary embolism, you need to ask about hemoptysis. This is 25,000 chest pain patients, adult chest pain patients. It's not there in many thousands. Asking about a risk predisposition for an acute aortic dissection is not there in 18,000 pulmonary embolism risk factors. Hey, did you travel? Have you been immobilized? Do you have a coagulopathy? Is not there in many thousands, and you kind of get the idea here. We've got the research, we've got the med-mal, it's pointing in a particular direction. You are looking at a significant part of the reason why we are having what you're seeing below the waterline, what you're seeing above the waterline is on this graph right here. That begs the question. If you can get folks up to 90%, you can do better than that. A lot of medical directors will tell me, I want 95%. I'm looking for 100%. Those are not subtleties there. Those are not nuances there. Those are basic elements of the history and the physical examination. And so we're looking for good numbers. Well, 20 years ago, HCA said, you know what, we're looking for those kind of numbers. We're having a hard time, we're having issues, there's medical errors, there's medical malpractice. Let's do something about it. And they did. Clinical alignment around the diagnostic drivers over a 7-year period. Before we built their electronic health record, we were working with education, we were working with analytics, people bought in, we got to 90%. Just one of those key elements inside of those drivers is evaluating very abnormal vital signs. They were sending 19% of their very abnormal vital signs home at the beginning of this. It went down to under 1. That risk predisposition started at 40, goes up to 85%. Key clinical alignment around the diagnostic drivers and elements we've identified that we should be looking at from the research and from the medical malpractice data. And if you get there, does it make a difference? Yeah, it makes a difference. Huge reduction in medical errors and diagnosis related claims. Subarachnoid hemorrhage, you saw the data on that from Tom, dropped 87%. Failure to diagnose pulmonary embolism, dropped 84%. Aortic disasters, meningitis, acute myocardial infarction, appendicitis, and happy to share more data with you if you ever want to spend some time and take a look at it. We did this with several other very large organizations. This was 3 this was 3,000 emergency physicians, 7 million emergency department visits per year. It makes a difference. Well, sort of bigger picture here, what are the top contributing factors to what we're seeing when we're really light focused on what's below the waterline, and this is absolutely, we're seeing this from the med-mal as well. The literature, lack of knowledge, adequate knowledge base from 4 insurance companies in the early 2000s, lapses in clinical judgment, 76% of cases from CRICO. There's another really interesting area here. We believe that the visit doesn't really stop when the patient walks out the door. But how do we communicate with them? We've been working on this for years. How do we continue to work with the patient when they've left the emergency department? Remember all those bounce backs we've been talking about? How do we keep that communication up? We'll talk for a moment about follow-up care and coordination, and then high reliability in the clinical environment, working on a partnership there as well. So the Sullivan Group, what have we been doing over the years? There's huge learning management system full of risk and safety courses, really powerful. We build this inside of electronic health records and electronic medical records, and we'll show you that in just a moment. But it gets back to that basic blocking and tackling, the basic elements of the history physical. You get that built as a risk mitigation module inside of an electronic health record. Communication and care coordination, I'm going to focus on that with you, and high reliability in the clinical environment. And let's jump into this decision making and documentations. Solutions to impact diagnosis related errors, decision making and documentation. So the slide is a little bit busy, but we wanted to share with you the fact that since 1999, we've recognized that the things that we all do for risk and safety also important. We have webinars, we have WebExes, we have books, we have white papers, we give lectures, I've given thousands. What's tomorrow look like? Tomorrow looks like that same information at the point of care. And we've been working on that for over 2 decades. In my own emergency department, we had a program called Pulse Check. Talked to Pulse Check and I said, let's build this risk mitigation module inside your electronic medical record. And it was phenomenal. Incredible feedback from people who were using it. A couple of years later, MedHost called and said, hey, Pulse Check is killing us with that risk and safety inside their program. Let's build it inside of MedHost. We did that, more installs. Epic called, Kaiser called us and said, you know what, we're on Epic. Can you fix Epic for us? Well, that is not that's a big lift, but we worked with Epic and the 36 emergency departments with Kaiser. HCA, who we've been working with 2 decades, said, hey, build that into Meditech. We did that. Advent Health called and said, hey, let's build that into Cerner. We've been doing this for a long time. We have a lot of experience. A medical professor based on the new fire protocols. The most recent I want to focus on because something special happened about 18 months ago when we recognized that Nuance and Dragon have taken a deep dive into the world of healthcare. And of course they're in the lion's share of hospitals with their front end speech recognition. And I didn't know that they went anywhere else, but they do. We came into a partnership about 18 months ago with Nuance because they've got an artificial intelligence platform. We've been doing that work inside of electronic medical record and health records for a long time. And the opportunity to work with an AI platform at the point of care real time with a company who specializes in front end speech was just too good to pass up. And I know this image here goes a little Tony Stark on you, but honestly, we are not that far from what you are looking at right here, as using artificial intelligence at the point of care, providing conditional algorithms, checklists, and decision support real time during the patient encounter. What what an opportunity. It's absolutely the road to the future, and you have to do this right. It can't be sitting on top of stuff. It can't be popping up in people's faces. It can't be hard stops. Human factors engineering, it's got to be visually available comfortably in a practitioner's workflow. So I'm going to share with you a program called ED Guidance that we developed together with Nuance. Nuance has got the platform. We've got the content that's built on all the things that Tom and I have been talking about in the last little while. You are probably familiar with Epic, Cerner, Meditech, who have basically got the marketplace. And in that, and this is a mock-up of those environments. If your world is Epic, you probably have moved to a MyNote, a white space like this, a smart phrase, drop in a template, start typing and dictating. If you're on Cerner, you are probably moving from PowerNote to dynamic documentation, which frankly is 4 white spaces where you drop in your macros and you drop in your documentation. And so assume that what you're looking at, Meditech, same thing. And assume what you're looking at here is one of those environments. I've got a 21-year-old here, Christopher, and you smart phrase macro drop in your template and you start creating your medical record. Over here is ED Guidance. This is my shock to find out that Nuance has created a platform that lives outside of and communicates with everything inside the medical record. It gets everything. It gets chief complaint. It gets filled in from the nurse. It gets vital signs. It gets filled in from the nurse. If I type something or dictate something, it gets them. You give us an environment where we can communicate with everything in that medical record, and we can begin to provide our logic, our diagnostic drivers, the things that we overlook, the things that we forget. And when you start thinking about applying artificial intelligence to risk and safety, it's just sort of like you just go wild. The wheels start spinning, and it's just very exciting. So we've got here is a 21-year-old male with severe back pain. What's the big deal? Oh, probably musculoskeletal pain. That's why I said, remember that case we started with, because this is that case, or very close to that case. I remember the 5 medical errors. We made those 5 medical errors, and that's a real case, by the way. I know the person that missed that case. So, but let's apply artificial intelligence to this. 21-year-old male, severe back pain that goes to the cloud and returns diagnostic drivers. This is ED Guidance. There's nothing you need to do here. It's a checklist. It's a reminder. You can close this. You can open it. You can put it on your second monitor. But here's those things we tend to forget. Fever, was it rapid or sudden? Was it 2 levels of pain, 1 level of pain? What is there a fever on the trackboard? So as you begin to make your chart, you start addressing those key elements that we know relate to the failure to diagnose. They relate to medical error. It's basic elements of the history and physical. There isn't anything complicated here. Nobody looks at this and says, oh, that's too subtle. That's really a nuance. No, these are basic elements of the history and physical. And so as you're creating your chart, ED Guidance is hearing it, it's understanding it, and it's retiring those things. Well, I got most of my history here, but forgot the fever. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm running around like a crazy person, and I see this, my chart, or I got this chart from a nurse practitioner, or I got it from a physician assistant or my scribe, and oh, we didn't ask about the fever. Okay, let's ask about the fever. Yep, there's been fever and shaking chills over the last 2 weeks. So what happens then? Recognize that, it retires fever, and it says, hey, maybe think about the possibility of a spinal epidural abscess and the differential diagnosis. Like Tom said, this is unusual. You're not going to see this very often. For the purposes of demonstrating this to you, I'm showing, hey, maybe you should be thinking about this. It also just added something I forget all the time. What are the risk factors for this? I might remember diabetes, I might forget IV drug abuse, but there they are. And so when you think back to the case that I presented, it had, didn't ask about a history of fever. Okay, I've been reminded. I asked the question. I'm going to be reminded to check the trackboard. I'm going to be reminded to ask about, remember that risk predisposition error that was made? It's right there. So let's keep going with our chart here. I'm I haven't seen a spinal epidural abscess in a long time. Well, I don't often need decision support. Maybe I'm a resident. I've never seen one of these spinal epidural abscess. Maybe I'm a veteran. I haven't seen one of these in many years. And so decision support, if you need it, it should be available inside the user interface. If you walked into an emergency department, if you're an emergency physician, you know what I'm talking about. If you're not an emergency physician, you probably know a lot about it if you're on this Teams meeting. You know we're pulling a cell phone out of our pocket to look up a calculator or a dermatome map. You know we're going to the internet. We're doing a Google search. We're doing a wiki search. Or we're doing an independent search. Our position is you build that in. It should be here. It should be one click. You never leave Christopher's chart to go get what it is that you need. Also, interesting part of this program is when you say back pain and 21-year-old male that went to the cloud and it returned ED guidance and risk resources, that's Internet Point of Care CME, Category 1. So if I see this patient and a child with fever and an abdominal pain patient, I'm going to have 3, 4, 5 credits that people can claim from the Sullivan Group at any time. I'm going to move on here, but each of the errors in the typical missed spinal epidural abscess case are right here as a reminder. Whether you leave this closed, make your chart and open it at the end, or leave it open, put it on your second monitor, and then just get the wheels turning. Think about the things that we can do if we can access everything in that medical record. Remember the test result analysis? This can do it. This can see everything in the chart. All right, let me jump ahead here. And the last major area we want to cover for today, we have, as I mentioned, for a long time, been dealing with the patient before they got to the emergency department, because we've been doing online education for years. That's before you get to the emergency department. We've been building things into the electronic health record. So we're interacting with the patient and the practitioner while the patient's in the emergency department. But what about when the patient goes home? For many years, and I know Tom did the same thing, an abdominal pain patient I'm not so sure about. I got a headache patient I'm a little concerned about. I think everything is okay. What do? I take the chart, I make a copy. This is pre-HIPAA. I took it home, called the patient at home, put the phone number right on there, called him up. How you doing? Oh, my belly pain's worse, and now it's down in the right lower quadrant. Send him right to the OR. Over the years, thousands and thousands of these cases. That's not efficient. But there's a new market that is opened with Epic, Cerner, Meditech, communication and care coordination, the ability to get the patient hooked into the system, through my hospital, my scripts, whatever. And you access this through Epic, through Cerner, through Meditech, and in partnership with an organization I'll talk about in just a minute. We are extending risk and safety home with the patient. And it's a good idea. 2015, what did National Academy of Medicine say? Facilitate more effective teamwork. Get the patient involved. Get the family involved. How do you do that? You don't do that with a piece of paper from home. You have to do that in some kind of an efficient and coordinated fashion. So we partnered with the Care Loop organization because that's what they do. We have the content. We know what to say to the patient when they walk out the door. We have 55 post-discharge pathways that automatically get delivered. How do they get on Care Loop? You press a button on Epic. You walk up to the patient with a barcode, and they've got the app on their phone, and so does their family. They've all got the app. And when they go home, there's going to be, see over here on the right, there's a 6-hour check-in. Hey, how you doing? Certain questions that are appropriate for an abdominal pain patient at 6 hours. 12-hour check-in, 24, 72. Remember the bounce backs? The bounce back, the back pain bounce back. Let's talk to the patient before they bounce back. let's deal with what's below the waterline. Let's shine a light on what's going on there. And it's really as simple as here's your 12-hour, here's your 24, here's your 72-hour check-in. You can see the questions on the left. Well, so that's it. And I want to just do a quick summary here, and we've got a couple of minutes left. Tom, if you've got any other comments or questions or thoughts, but let me just summarize. Diagnostic errors. The scope of the problem is not adequately represented by malpractice claims, so we do the deep dive into the research. It's getting better. It's getting to be really high quality, and we need to go there to truly understand, way beyond malpractice, just the tip of the iceberg, really understand the frequency and the severity. And we need to do something else with it than we've been doing for the last 3 decades, because those numbers aren't moving. That failure to diagnose isn't moving. We see several common contributing factors that lead to the breakdown in the diagnostic process. That one section of the presentation, we call them diagnostic drivers, opportunities for improvement in clinical practice and documentation. We know what the clinical entities are that we're missing. 25 years of research, we know the basic elements of the history, the physical exam, medical decision-making, test analysis. We know where we need to be with these diagnostic drivers. Our solutions have evolved to include this new artificial intelligence capability in our relationship with Nuance, new care coordination platforms. We are sorry about the typo. We are embracing and harnessing those technologies to really create a new day, a new path, a new opportunity to dig in and deal with the problem both above and below the waterline, and engaging the Sullivan Group to collaborate on new developments, new research, new partnerships. I welcome you to get the white paper. If there's anything that we've talked about that you're interested in, interested partners, Brant Roth at thesullivangroup.com, interested clients, Jenna Pichet at thesullivangroup.com. And again, you on this call, you are partners, your colleagues, friends, some of you very dear friends of mine over the years, and happy to be back with you today and providing you an opportunity to get a glimpse into what we've been doing, and hopefully you'll agree with us, a glimpse into what our future looks like. I'm going to close off, Tom. I don't know if you have any more comments for the crowd before we sign off.
Dan, you put it so well, but I'll just echo that even though we haven't reduced the frequency of some of these diagnostic errors in the past 2 decades, I really feel, having been in this now for 2 or 3 decades, we're in a new era. We're in a new era of research and innovation that is a revolution in patient safety, especially in acute care medicine, where we have lived and breathed. So I'm very hopeful, and I think that using what great data we're now getting from all comers, both medical and claims research, these partnerships and innovations using technology are going to hardwire these solutions into the continuum of patient care for their benefit. And the corollary benefit will be less cost, less disability, fewer claims, and so other surrogate measurements. But I'm very hopeful that there will be an impact, and it won't be long before I think that as these tools are adopted and similar tools and innovations are adopted, we will start to see improvements in these what I call horrific rates of diagnostic error.
Thanks, Tom. Well put. And our mission, patient safety, really exciting, great opportunities harnessing these technologies. Thanks again to everybody from the Sullivan Group who helped us put this together. Thank you for joining us. Wish you a great day and stay safe. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dan and Tom, and thank you everyone for joining us today. That concludes our presentation. We will circulate the recording of today's presentation along with the white paper referenced. You can also set up time with Dr. Sullivan or Syzek to discuss any further questions you might have after reviewing this information. You can also email Brant or I. Our emails are here on screen to learn more about how you can leverage the Sullivan Group's trusted clinical content to reduce diagnostic errors and improve patient safety. Thanks for your time and have a great afternoon.